Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Okay, so we've seen the Ryzen 5 3600 battle it out with the Core i5 9400F in over 30 games. You've also seen the 3900X and 9900K duke it out in a few dozen titles. But today, we have the most epic battle of them all. Intel versus AMD box coolers. Yep, this is the big one. We thought it may never happen, but thanks to countless hours of work, we've been able to make it happen. Okay, so I might be overselling this one a bit, but still, it is something I've wanted to do for a long time now, and I haven't really been able to do it, at least using a satisfactory test method. Last year, I did cut the mounting hardware off a Wraith stealth cooler, as well as one of the Intel box coolers, and then I jerry-rigged them to an AM4 motherboard and applied similar levels of pressure. The results were interesting. I didn't publish the results. It was just something I did and then decided not really to make a video out of it. But yeah, part of the way these coolers perform is the mounting system. So you've got to apply the correct amount of pressure onto the CPU's heat spreader. So anyway, I didn't make that video, but yeah, it was a bit of fun anyway. Even though it was never meant to be serious content, I wanted the results to be as accurate as possible. Anyway, long story short, after recently testing the Wraith Spire against the Wraith Spire, someone requested an Intel versus AMD box cooler comparison and suggested I could use the new ASRock X570 Phantom Gaming ITX TB3 to do it. The reason that particular AM4 motherboard was recommended for this test was because it uses the LJ1156 mounting holes, meaning it has native support for Intel box coolers. ASRock's done this to save space on the board, and I wasn't going to miss the opportunity to stick the crappy Intel box cooler on the Ryzen 5 3600. So I acquired the Phantom Gaming ITX and got testing. Now, this motherboard can only support Intel coolers, so to test the Wraith range on the R5 3600, I used the ASRock Steel Legend. Since we're using the exact same CPU with the same settings, this should provide accurate results. However, the only potential issue being the board layout. The mini ITX board is extremely cramped. There's basically no open space around the cooler, and that will obviously negatively impact cooling performance, as it heavily restricts airflow. Therefore, to replicate this on the Steel Legend, which is a much more open, bigger ATX motherboard, I encompassed the Wraith coolers with a strip of cardboard, and then I sort of modified that cardboard to replicate the airflow obstacles of the ITX board. The next issue I ran into was the fan speed. Typically, the Intel box coolers are noisy little buggers that spin almost fast enough to separate the fan blades. Okay, so that's a bit of an exaggeration, but still, last time I tested one with the Core i7-8700 on a Z390 board, it spun at between 3,000 and 3,500 RPM. On the Phantom Gaming ITX though, the fan never spun faster than 2,100 RPM, which is an issue for the Intel box cooler, as it really relies on fan speed to keep temperatures under control, or at least stops the CPU from melting through the PCB. Anyway, I messed around for quite some time, but I couldn't get the fan to spin up to full speed for more than a few seconds. With the limited fan speed, I decided to target 2000 RPM with the coolers tested. So with the fan speed somewhat normalized and the same airflow restrictions in place, I got testing. However, I will note that for truly accurate data, I should have locked the voltage and multiplier of the CPU, but since this isn't a super serious test, I decided to leave the R5 3600 on auto to do its thing. For those of you wondering, as there have been multiple different models over the years, I'm using the Intel E97378-001 and the E97379-001. Pretty catchy names, I know. The E97378 features a copper core with aluminium fins and was first bundled with the Sandy Bridge Core i5 and Core i7 processors. I'm just going to refer to this one as the copper model. Then we have the E97379, and this is the aluminium cooler, and it was first bundled with the Core i3 Sandy Bridge processors. Intel used the copper insert version for not just the Sandy Bridge i5 and i7 processors, but also the Ivy Bridge and Haswell generations. By the time Skylake was released, they dumped the copper model entirely in favour of the cheaper all-aluminium model. So this meant CPUs such as the 6-core 12-thread Core i7-8700 came with the pathetic aluminium cooler, and we made a video about this last year. We showed it throttled and ran at 100 degrees out of the box. It seems Intel just doesn't care. They're shipping the new Core i7-9700, a $330 US 8-core processor with the exact same cooler. So that's pretty tragic to say the least. Anyway, here's the results, just one blue bar graph. I know, I'm worse than Intel. Okay, so the Wraith Prism, the cooler AMD supplies with the Ryzen 7 3700X, 3800X, and the Ryzen 9 3900X, saw the R5 3600 peak at just 71 degrees when spinning with its fan at 2100 RPM, and remember, it is being choked here by a little bit of cardboard. So the Prism has set the benchmark at 71 degrees. Coming in just a few degrees warmer is the copper version of the Wraith Spire. It allowed the Ryzen processor to hit 74 degrees, though the CPU did drop down 50 MHz in clock speed at the slightly higher temperature, so the thermal load was ever so slightly reduced. Then we have the all-aluminium version of the Spire, which comes with the 3600X. It allowed the vanilla 3600 to peak at 77 degrees, which is getting up there, but is much better than what we see with the really little coolers. The Wraith Stealth, for example, saw the Ryzen processor hit 90 degrees, and that's far from ideal, but at this temperature the R5 3600 still maintained 4050 MHz, but it had to be really close to dropping down to a flat 4000 MHz, as this is the very frequency we saw the CPU run at with the copper version of Intel's box cooler, and it only ran a degree hotter. As for the all-aluminium version of the box cool that Intel's been bundling with their non-K SKUs for years now, well, that allowed the R5 3600 to hit 95 degrees, which forced it down to 3975 MHz. So that's bad, but pretty much what I was expecting to find, if I'm honest. Well, for a kind of pointless test, I have to admit this was quite a bit of fun. Something I've wanted to do for a while now, at least do it to a high degree of accuracy, and we've been able to do that here. Haven't really learnt anything new. It's not going to shock you guys to learn that the Intel box cooler is not very good, and really shouldn't even be put on a 65 watt CPU, let alone one that can suck down around 140 watts. Some of them do even more than that. The Wraith Stealth, yeah, that's not really much better, to be honest. So, you know, AMD's budget box cooler is not particularly awesome, but in AMD's defense, they generally only reserve that cooler for their most low-end parts. That's why it's their budget cooler. So you'll find that on quad-core parts and low-end APUs, stuff like that. So it's not really a big deal that the Wraith Stealth isn't a particularly impressive cooler. That said, the Ryzen 5 3600 does come with the Wraith Stealth, but it's such a good value CPU at $200 that throwing another $20 or so at it really isn't a big deal. The $220 to $300 CPUs have always been upgraded to the Wraith Spire, and it allowed the Ryzen 5 3600 to operate almost 20 degrees cooler when compared to the current Intel box cooler. Then if you spend $330 or more, you get the Wraith Prism, and that ran 24 degrees cooler. As I said earlier in the video, I really can't believe Intel ships their current generation Core i7 9700 with that aluminium box cooler. The thing weighs just 168 grams, and we know it caused the 8700 to throttle quite heavily, so it's going to do the same for the 9700 as well. Meanwhile, for the same price, the Ryzen 7 3700X comes with the 552 gram Wraith Prism, and that's over 3 times the metal. I have no idea how Intel gets away with it. Over a year ago now, after Computex 2018, I created a video titled Things Intel Needs to Fix. I also created a version for AMD and Nvidia as well, but there were plenty more issues to talk about when addressing the things Intel needs to fix. One of the first things I mentioned was the box cooler, and now more than a year later, nothing's changed. Shocker, right? It'll be interesting to see if they make any improvements in this area for their upcoming 10th generation core series. I'm certainly not counting on it though, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see if anything changes. And just last week, I was lightly grilling AMD for downgrading the Wraith Spire by removing the copper vapor chamber, but I also noted at the time that it was really hard to crack the whip when AMD was still giving us 30% more metal with the current Spire when compared to the Intel box cooler. Yet despite that, I've noticed quite a few people like to rag on the Wraith box cooler range, and I'm not really sure why. I mean, yeah, sure, you can go out and buy a tower-style cooler for as little as $20 US, and that is quite a reasonable upgrade, but the added convenience of having quite a good quality box cooler is great in my opinion. Very handy to have as a backup, and you don't necessarily have to upgrade. So I've found, for example, the 3700X to be perfectly usable with the Wraith Prism box cooler, It's not particularly loud. It looks pretty good. And the CPU peaked at 78 degrees in an AVX workload after an hour. So yeah, that wasn't a well-ventilated case in a 21-degree room, but still, that is quite an impressive result. Anyway, as always, I'm very keen to hear from you guys. Be quite interesting to hear what the majority of you thought. Were you surprised by how poorly or perhaps how well these did? Maybe they did better than you expected. I mean, that's not a whole lot of aluminium, so maybe you're expecting them to do even worse than they did. Not sure. I think it was probably... These guys will probably helped a little bit by the fact that the Ryzen 5 3600 did drop down a little bit in frequency, possibly dropped a bit of voltage there as well, so the thermal load was reduced ever so slightly, which could have tacked on a few more degrees for these guys. If I went back and did it again, I probably would lock voltages and frequency and all that for a more apples to apples comparison, but, you know, like I said, it was not exactly... Well, let's be honest, it's not really an important test, so... I think we got it as accurate as we needed to. Anyway, if you did like the video, you know what to do. You can also subscribe for more content. And if you really enjoy what we do for Unboxed, then you can get more involved by signing up for our Patreon account. You get access to behind the scenes content, exclusive Discord chat, and then the monthly live streams. Tim and I will actually be doing this month's live stream in a couple of days' time, next Tuesday. So if you're interested, sign up for that. It's $1 US a month. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time. That's how I do that, isn't it? Is that right?